unless there are huge swings, the impact on the trajectory of inflation is not that relevant.
Chair Powell, Mr. Carlson was talking about a gray box. What's your gray box? Is there something that you wish you knew that would help in setting monetary policy? Only one thing.
Yeah, no, I'd go back to the same thing really, which is what did we get wrong? And that really was looking at these supply side issues and believing that they would be resolved relatively quickly. And that by that I mean there were going to be vaccinations, everyone would get vaccinated, so the millions of people who dropped out of the labor force would come right back in, so wages wouldn't be under such pressure. That didn't happen for a range of reasons. It didn't happen. In addition, the bottlenecks and the shortages haven't been alleviated yet. And then on the back of that comes the new shock in the form of the war. But it wasn't something wrong with our models, because it wasn't in the models at all. It was a question of how to assess the persistence of these supply side shocks. And I do think that there'll be, to Augustin's point, and there is a lot of work going on to get smarter about the supply side. In the nature of it, though, it was a deep in the tail kind of a risk, and those are very hard to predict and assess when they come.
Yeah. Because monetary policy is not an exact science, how often do you actually speak on the phone to exchange ideas? Do you call each other and say, like, well, I've done it this way?
I can help out. I mean, because part of my job is to be able to attract them to Basel 2 times every 2 months, to have very, very deep and open exchange of views.
We do tell them, but we're not going to tell them.
And you all show up.
Yeah, you'll show up. We speak quite often.
Quite a lot, but you're not going to tell me. President Lagarde, the ECB decided to apply flexibility to reinvestments from Friday, July the 1st. What will be the guideposts?
We decided. Look, I think, if you allow, I'd like to just come back to why that is. Yeah. Because I think that this risk of fragmentation that is much talked about is something that is very inherent to the European construction. Yeah. And to the fact that we have 19, soon 20, but let's say 19 for the moment, member states that each have their respective fiscal policy, that each have their respective financial markets. And as a result of that, our unique monetary policy has to be transmitted throughout this imperfect market of ours, which has no fiscal union, no monetary union, no capital markets union. And as a result of that, we just have to make sure that our monetary policy stance is actually transmitted throughout the entire euro area. And the two of them, I think I used that word, I don't know if it exists in English, but they are consubstantial. For our stance to be effective, it has to be transmitted throughout, okay? So to do that, if we see that there are unwarranted disruption to that transmission, and if our stance is impaired as a result, we need to take action. And that is the reason we decided that we would use, as of, you're right, Friday, that's what I said yesterday, we would use the flexibility in the reinvestment of our pandemic emergency purchase program redemptions in order to address the potential risk of fragmentation. Second, we also decided, and it's work in progress, so I'm not going to comment upon it. I know that some would like to have details and understand before everybody else, and particularly before the Governing Council, what the details of that instrument will be, but we decided to reinforce our capacity to properly transmit our monetary policy by devising a new tool that will be considered by the Governing Council of the ECB on July the 21st. So don't waste your time asking me for details, criteria, conditions, safeguards. All I said is that it has to be effective, it has to be proportional, it has to include the right level of safeguards. And that's all I will say at this point.
Okay. How do you direct staff?
And it will be effective, and it will be proportional, and it will have safeguards, and it will be there, believe me.
So how do you direct staff? I'm going to try my luck one more time. How do you direct staff when they design this new tool?
I said what I had to say.
The lady is not for turning, is the famous way. How do you look at China, Mr. Carstens? How should we look at China at the moment?
Well, I mean, it is of the essence that things start improving more quickly in China. I mean, certainly we need the growth that has come from China. They play a very important role in the supply chains. I mean, many of the tensions we're seeing around the world could be mitigated by having higher growth rates around the world. I mean, part of the way we have started this conversation was trying to assess, or you wanting to hear our thoughts about how can we bring down inflation without affecting growth. If we have other sources of growth, that would make the whole adjustment process simpler. Now, what is one major engine of growth that has not been contributing as much as it could? I have to say China. No, they have problems that are well known. One that I hope that can be resolved soon is the one in the housing market. I mean, the housing market has been, or that sector, it's a very important contributor to growth. A lot of, certainly very much impact in the rest of the global economy, and it's a sector where the Chinese authorities have been working a lot, trying to bring it back to its foot, and hopefully they're close. But I mean, I would say at this stage, for their own sake, they're not growing as much as they certainly would like, and certainly they're not growing at the pace I would like them to see growth, because I think it would help us a lot in trying to solve some of the tensions we're living today.
Do you think we'll see, Chair Powell, more deglobalization, and how that will impact our economies going forward?
So there's certainly a threat of that, and this is not the work of the central banks, but I do think it would be a plus if we were to find a way to for China to take part diplomatically and economically according to a common set of rules, and that would be a big plus for global growth if we could get back on a path to that. But it's obviously that's the work of elected governments, not for us. In terms of globalization, yes, I mean you can imagine a world. It's not hard to imagine a world where we break into these blocks again, and that would be a world of lower productivity and lower incomes over time. It doesn't have to happen that way. People are looking at shorter and more durable supply chains. It's not clear how much of that will happen, and if so, what would be the effects. That could be more secure, but perhaps not as efficient as the long but fragile supply chains that we've had. So I think it's a very important question, and there's certainly a risk that the benefits of globalization would be lost. But obviously there were benefits and there were costs to the advanced economy, certainly.
I mean, a question for all of you, and Chair Powell, I'll start with you. What have we learned about the last 10 years of monetary policy? Some of the tools that were used, be it QE or in other parts of the world, even negative rates.
So the last 10 years were so far the height of the disinflationary forces that we faced, and really it goes back before the global financial crisis, but really since the global financial crisis, we had very low inflation. In the United States, we had 3.5% unemployment for a couple of years, or right in that range for a couple of years, and inflation didn't react at all. So we had that gave us the ability to really lean into the maximum employment mandate, and we did that, and I think that was the right thing to do in that world. That world seems to be gone now, at least for the time being, and we're living with, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're living with different forces now, and have to think about monetary policy in a very different way. So I think if you want to know the lessons to be learned of the last 10 years, look at our framework. Those were all based on a low inflation, environment that we had, and now we're in this new world where it's quite different, with higher inflation and many supply shocks and strong inflationary forces around the world. It's quite a different environment.
President Lagarde, how do you think we'll look at negative rates, first of all?
Well, I look at it in a similar way to Jay, and I think the last 10 years have been 10 years of heroic fight against disinflationary forces, with central banks demonstrating great agility to innovate and find sometimes alternative, accommodative ways of dealing with forces that have nothing to do with what we are experiencing now. So we're certainly learning from that period, but we are in a new environment, which also, I think, will force us to show agility and capacity to respond fast to data that we are receiving at an accelerated pace and with a scene that is changing geopolitically as well as economically.
Mr. Carstens, do you think...
But I don't want to sound too dark, because I think that there are also good things happening. You know, I was reflecting on your comments, Jay, and, you know, think back, December 20, when we thought that this pandemic was going to hit us for the next 2 years, at least, until such time when vaccination would come to market. And vaccination came about in a matter of, 9 months, as opposed to the 3 years that it normally takes. In the same way, everybody expected a couple of weeks ago that the Geneva Agreement of WTO would be a complete illusion, would never happen. Well, certain things happen when there is goodwill, agility, creativity. So I have great faith in human inventivity and talent, particularly when it includes women.
To your point, though, a lot of these problems are happening because the recovery and the expansion have been so much stronger than and faster than expected. If you look in the U.S. labor market as an example now, it's a very good time to be in the labor market. You can, there are 2 job openings effectively for every unemployed person. So people are switching jobs, they're getting pay increases. It's a terrific labor market. The problem is that wages are moving up in some areas at levels that are not consistent over time with 2% inflation. So it's kind of overheated. Nonetheless, it's a byproduct of a very strong recovery.
Governor Bay, on pay increases, I mean, the UK is going through a bit of a bumpy ride with a lot of pay increases. How do you see that developing?
Well, of course, it's a reflection of the inflation world we're in at the moment. I mean, I'm on record as having said a few months ago that, and I'll be careful because I'll get it right and precise in terms of what I said, that I think very high pay increases, and particularly. And this applies to both pay increases and price setting by companies. If everybody tries to beat the inflation, and particularly the version we're having, which is this imported inflation shock, which we just we can't avoid, then it will set the second round effects off. And of course, yes, we are seeing some of that tension unfold. I would have to note that rather more people seem to be agreeing with me today than were doing several months ago. But that's not the point. I mean, the point is, yes, I think it was likely that we would see this, but I think I have to say the point about second round effects holds as much today as it did then. I mean, that's the risk, and that's why we will, set monetary policy, obviously, to offset those if they emerge to get back to target. We will have to do that, and that's I'm afraid, a thin code for saying the more they emerge, the higher rates will have to be.
But what sort of pay rises could be alarming for the Bank of England? Is anything above 2% inflationary?
Well, I don't think that's the right way to look at it, because obviously there's always a productivity angle to it in terms of how pay is set. And it's very important that, I made a general comment about second round effects, but of course pay is set in a market, and that's important, and it must continue to be set in a market. So it's wrong to say across the economy this is the right number, because it isn't. Different cases and different situations. But I would just emphasize this point about second round effects, which is the crucial point for monetary policy.
Mr. Carstens, has there been an over-reliance actually on monetary policy in the last 10 years?
Well, I mean, I think even going a little bit further away, 2007, 2008, monetary policy needed to respond, to put it in a different way, lack of resilience in growth. And yes, to some extent, policies that traditionally are meant to support some fluctuations in the business cycle have probably been used a little bit more with probably in a more lasting way. And my sense is the role of fiscal and monetary policy to stabilize the business cycle into the future are hitting limits. Fiscal policy is obvious because there are issues of debt sustainability, or can be issues of debt sustainability. And well, now if we had a long period where monetary policy could have an impact on growth because, as Christine said, as Jay Powell and Andrew have said, we faced a very, I would say, specific period of time of very low inflation, and where monetary policy could make, if you had the instrument, why not use it, no? But I think what we should learn, and this is not only, I mean, at the end of the day, the economies do not depend only on monetary policy. At the end of the day, they depend on fiscal, monetary, but also many other real policies that are out there. And what we have seen is in the last 10, 20 years, it's a very unreliable process of economic growth in the world. Some, of course, have been distorted by issues like wars or pandemics, but even before, I mean, we don't have the resiliency in growth that we would like to see. And that puts at different points in time a lot of stress on fiscal and monetary policy. And at some point that has some impact. So I think, yes, monetary policy will have to adjust, will have to evolve. We are learning lessons. But I think where we need to work more is to understand growth and how can we promote it in a more reliable fashion.
Who doesn't agree with that on the panel? Does everybody?
It depends what kind of growth. And I really think that the determination of the Europeans to focus and encourage investment in the green growth is critically important. If we want to develop the economic potential of any economy, you have to go in that direction.
That's the part of reliability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And resilience.
Yeah.
If you don't. Yeah. Okay.
Governor Bailey and then Chair Powell.
Well, I was going to observe, I mean, a point I was going to comment on following what Jay and Christine were saying earlier about what we've learned from the last 10 years, and then make a point on growth. I mean, one of the things we learned over that period was that the sort of the underlying interest rate, the sort of structural R-star, seems to have gone down for a long period of time, actually, certainly in the UK when we look at it. The question is, what do we learn? You know, these structural issues that we're facing today, what do they imply for it? I'm probably not in the same place as Charles Goodart, because I think these trends are so long run, particularly on the sort of population side, on longevity side, that they have quite a long way to play out, even on the basis of what we know today. So I think the underlying story will obviously move, but there's a lot that's sort of built into it already. Just on the shorter run point on growth, I mean, I think one of the puzzles which we're certainly looking at on that, though, if you take that sort of underlying story of the last decade, certainly in the UK economy, is why hasn't investment been greater? Because there's a gap opened up between the sort of the risk-free rate and the return earned in the risk-taking environment, and yet investment has been very subdued. Now, I think the other question we have to ask there, but are we capturing investment there? I mean, it's something we're looking at certainly, which is there just more investment of a non-traditional sort, which probably not wholly, but in part helps to explain that. But I think, I see that as an important issue to understand in terms of what we want to know going forwards, because there's no question that investment is, Christine was saying, in terms of climate change, it is a big part of the picture going forward, and how we solve some of these issues that we've been living with in terms of low investment and low productivity in our case as well.
Chair Powell, do you think we've been over-reliant, actually, on monetary policy, especially as the Fed?
Yes, I do. I would just say, I think that in economic discussion generally, there's much too much focus on demand management and not enough on things that will make us grow at the maximum sustainable level, sustainable growth in the longer run. There's not enough focus on that. And that isn't the Fed's job. That's more the job of, again, elected governments. But I'd like to see more of that.
So how should governments be thinking about their economic policy going forward if monetary policy is not the only game in town?
You're asking me that?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of out of the business of giving advice to the fiscal authorities these days. So I would just say, I think when I get asked that by an elected representative, what I say is focus on investing in people and investing in things that will increase the productive capacity of the economy over time. That's what I say. And in terms of, I think what a central bank should do is stick to its knitting and do its job, and leave the major issues of the day to the elected representatives.
President Lagarde?
We have to stick to our knitting, that's for sure. But if we are asked for advice, we should give it. And I think that, to the extent that fiscal and monetaries have worked hand in hand during the pandemic and to good effect, I think we should also reflect on how fiscal can leverage what we do and how we can facilitate it. But we're not. This is no longer the same cooperation, hand in hand work that we used to do during the pandemic. And I would give the same advice: invest in people, invest in green, be targeted and focused, and in the medium term, the fiscal space has to be made sustainable for all countries, certainly in the euro area.
Yeah, Mr. Carstens, what's the correct way of fiscal policy to help monetary?
Well, I would definitely add my voice to invest in people, but I would say more in different aspects that enhance the human capabilities. Very specific. Well, education is one. I think what we have learned with the pandemic is that health systems are extremely important, and I think to a large extent we have invested there. The other thing is that all digitation will imply, and technological advance will really impose very, very dramatic pressures in many countries. And I think to how to adapt ourselves to that is very important. Climate change, as Christine said, is of the essence. In many parts of the world, incorporating ladies, females into the labor force is very important, and investing more in them, I think it's also of the essence. In many parts of the world, law and order is very important.
Yeah.
And so I mean, there is the good and bad things is that there is a lot to be done, but there is a wide variety of areas where we can act, and I think it can make a difference relatively soon.
Governor Bailey?
Well, I mean, Jay's right. Independence goes both ways in our world, and we must respect that, and we do. I think there's a common interest, going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, in understanding why the trend rate of growth has fallen, because it has, in our case, it has fallen. Now, I don't then, for a central bank, I'm not going to start prescribing what should be done about it, because I think in most cases that will be outside our remit. But obviously, we have a strong interest in the trend rate of growth, so understanding the trend rate of growth is an important thing, and it's something where we can collaborate in that sense, I think, perfectly happily.
It's 3:27, so we only have 3 minutes. And I mean, I'd like to ask you, just to close us off, Chair Powell, if you're speaking now to the American people to try and help them understand how long it will take for monetary policy to go back to something that resembles normalcy, what would you tell them?
I would say that we fully understand and appreciate how the pain people are going through dealing with higher inflation, that we have the tools to address that and the resolve to use them, and that we are committed to and will succeed in getting inflation down to 2%. The process is highly likely to involve some pain, but the worst pain would be from failing to address this high inflation and allowing it to become persistent.
President Lagarde?
Dito.
Governor Bailey?
Oh, absolutely. I would just add one thing that is to Jay's point and Christine's point about understanding the pain. This form of inflation is even more painful for those on low incomes because it is concentrated in the essentials, in energy and food. And when you look at the consumption baskets of different groups of income groups of the population, sadly, it's those on the lowest income are most concentrated in those things. And that is very difficult and something that obviously is very sad. But we have to do everything we can Because as Jay said, if we don't get it back to target, the consequences are worse.
Yeah. All right, it's 3:30 p.m., so thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for a great panel. I'm going to ask the gentleman to follow me, and Madame Agad, you stay on stage. Okay.
Thank you, Francine, for doing such an excellent job of moderating that session, and thanks to all of our panelists. We've seen a turning point, and now we've heard about how central bankers are grappling to avoid a tipping point where high inflation becomes entrenched. The clock is clearly ticking, but for now, faith holds. And now to the final part of our event. The Sintra Forum has brought together some of this generation's most prominent policymakers and academics. It has also sought to nurture young talent to address the answers to challenges future generations will face. We now would like to award the prize, chosen by an expert panel, and you, for the best paper by some of the most promising young economists in the world.
So, we've just seen the 10 finalists of this year's Young Economist Prize. Actually, they're all there. This time we can see them in real life because they're not on screen as they were last year and the year before. So it's very, very nice to see you all, and you're very welcome in this room. Yeah, let's... So you came from all over the world to present your research here in Sintra, and our colleagues from the research department were overwhelmed by the number of high-quality papers that they received. You are the top 10, but there were many others that were submitted that were of top quality as well. So all submissions were rated for both their academic quality and their policy relevance for Europe, and 10 of them, you, were selected to go through the final round of voting. It is an important moment for the forum, so I would like to thank you very, very much, all of you who have voted for the respective papers and for having spent a bit of time in front of their posters when they explained to you what their research was about. I would like to express real gratitude to all members of the panel who have evaluated your papers. They are Hélène Ray, professor at the London Business School, Ricardo Reis, professor of the London School of Economics, and my ECB colleagues Philippe Hartmann, Isabelle van Steenkist, and Yvan Jacquard. Thank you so much for having spent this time and having taken such an interest in the work that they did. Well done. So don't be shy. I know it's a moving moment, but you have to come on stage now. So it's really, really good to see you in person, and you have in front of you, the best and the brightest in central banking, in academia, in macroeconomics, and they are intimidated because you will be much better than they are at the moment. So I know it's not a very pleasant moment for 9 of you, and it's a delightful moment for 1 of you, but I'm going to have to do it. But I took some consolation from the fact that I was told by a friend of mine and a couple of other colleagues that just the fact that you were shortlisted and amongst the 10th actually gave you a chance to receive a few phone calls from people interested in hiring you. So in and of itself, that might be a bit of a price. But for this particular contest, I'm delighted to announce the winner of this year's Young Economist Prize, who will be awarded a 10,000 euros prize and this trophy, which is standing right there to my left. And the winner this year is Federico Cochen. Federico? So Federico, before I award you this, I just want to mention that you are a PhD student at the New York University. Your paper was on finance over the life cycle of firms. I have to say that Federico explained to me his research, and he gave me a great consolation this morning. You know what you feel like after some long hours and days. He explained to me that the older you are in the cycle, the more resilient you are. Fantastic message early in the morning. So thank you, Federico, in addition to everything else in your paper, which is far more important than the consolation that you gave me this morning. But so your paper highlights the importance of ensuring that young firms, which are more likely to face financial constraints, have access to external finance. Using European data and emphasizing the differences between countries, your paper shows that in times of great structural transformation, ensuring a steady flow of financing renders the process of firm entry and exit more efficient. So my warmest congratulations to you. Here is the trophy. Well done.
Thank you very much.
I will hold it for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Lagarde. This is really an honor and such a privilege for me. I also want to thank the members of the selection committee and all the members of the ECB which made this prize and this event possible. As well, I want to thank my fellow young economists. This has been really a privilege for me to be interacting and learning from you these days. Thank you very much. It's really such an honor. Thank you, President Lagarde.
Thank you. And can we give a big round of applause to the other 9 who have done a superb job? Terrific. You can just stay a little bit. It's nice to be up on stage. You have to get used to it. You'll do a lot of those things. So now it's the last moment. We all want to sort of let our hair down, enjoy a bit of outdoor activity maybe, or just rest, or keep looking at your emails and your messages, whichever you prefer. But it's time to wrap up, and I would like to really thank all of you for your participation, being in the audience, being so attentive. And I would like to address a particular thanks to the team of the ECB and those who have put in place this first after 2 years physical organization of this meeting. They've done a great job. The food was decent, wasn't it? And everything else in between. So to those who have organized it, really thank you very, very much. And you'll be pleased to know that we've decided that next year, again, it will be in physical format. And we'll see after that how we measure the cost benefit and the value added by being together relative to increasing, obviously, our environmental footprint. But we'll certainly this year, yeah, Vitor, we have to do these things nowadays. We do. But next year we'll be together for the 10th. In the meantime, obviously, there is going to be a lot of work that will be done, a lot of research. We are obviously in a slightly different environment as the chair and president of central banks have tried to demonstrate, and as has been fantastically documented and discussed in the course of the very great panel discussions that we had in the last couple of days. To all panelists, to all those who contributed their papers and their thought and shared their brain power with all of us, and those who led the panel exercise, which is not always easy because it's tempting to actually get involved and speak up and say what you have on your mind when in fact you have to just give way to those who have done the work. Thank you so much. We have a wonderful dinner that is offered by the National Central Bank of Portugal. We will see each other again, and we will see each other next year if you are so willing. Thank you very much.
I guess should we start with kind of a bit of the history first? Because, a lot of people would be unfamiliar with the idea of inflation being up in, close to double digits. But, there was a period when that was almost the norm for a while. Yeah. Can you remember what that was like and what that did to the economy, but also to households?
Well, really from the 1970s through until the early 1990s, inflation was something that people always talked about. Indeed, I think the best definition of getting away from inflation is when people stop talking about it. And sadly, today they are talking about it. And basically, inflation turns a healthy economy into a sick one because it becomes a process of constant catch-up. Your wage goes up, then it's my turn later on to bargain a wage. I start to think you're getting paid more than I am, then you think I'm getting paid more than you. It makes it very difficult for people to work out how expensive things are, whose wage is higher than somebody else's. And that makes it almost impossible for an economy to function because you don't know what the cheapest sources of supply or inputs are, what the cheapest kind of labor is, what kind of job to take. And certainly when inflation reached over 25% in the 1970s, this was something that really started to wreck the way the whole economy worked.
And your experience at the bank, I know you were governor somewhat later than that, but you can presumably recall the institutional battle with inflation and the aftermath of that. This was not an easy thing to get back into the box.
It was very difficult. In the 1980s, first of all, people tried to target the behavior of money, and that proved difficult in the early part. Then trying to use an exchange rate as a method of bringing inflation down. In the end, we had to have a very deep recession in the early 1990s to suppress inflation. And after that, when we left the exchange rate mechanism in September 1992, we introduced an inflation target. The Bank of England gained a degree of independent voice. Later, it was made fully independent in 1997. And inflation came down and stayed around 2%, and we've been there ever since until last year. So there was a very successful period in which inflation was brought down and people stopped talking about inflation.
But right now, people, like you say, are talking about it again. Do you feel there are legitimate echoes of that kind of 1970s experience right now?
I think there are, and I think it's a function of ideas. I think there was a serious mistake in the 1970s in which people thought that, well, if we accept a bit more inflation, we can have higher employment and output in the economy. That turned out to be false. And then, of course, that mistaken idea was compounded by some bad luck in the form of the oil price increases in 1970s. And there's a real parallel to that now, in which I think there are mistaken ideas floating around in the central banking world, compounded now by bad luck after the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
When you say mistaken ideas?
So I think the mistaken ideas are twofold, really, at present. The first is that people, I think, decided that when the pandemic hit, because output in the economy contracted, the right thing to do was to print a lot more money to stimulate spending, to try and bring demand back up. But that's not what the pandemic was about. The pandemic was about shutting down parts of the economy quite deliberately in order to prevent the spread of the disease. And that meant that if you simply print lots of money at a time when you're producing less, you've got a classic case of too much money chasing too few goods. And the result of that is inflation. And we started to see that last year in 2021. That was the first, I think, mistaken idea. And it's interesting that it was common to all central banks. They basically felt we must demonstrate that we're here, we must do something. But governments were doing a great deal through, in our case, the furlough scheme, which was very sensible. Other governments had their own schemes. This was a very sensible thing to do, but it didn't need central banks to print lots of extra money on top of all that. That's generated a rise in inflation, followed by the mistake, of course, that now I think have understandably worried about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on energy and food prices, which is not the responsibility of central banks. So that's pushed inflation up further, but it would have been above target in any event. It will come down next year and the year after. The question is, will it come down to 2% where it's supposed to be? And the argument of central banks essentially is, well, we're saying it will come down to 2%, so everyone will believe us, and so it will come down to 2%. Well, that's a very odd way of thinking about it. I call that the King-Canute theory of inflation. You sit there and you command the forces of the economy to bring inflation down to 2%, irrespective of whether you're prepared to raise interest rates enough to achieve that. And I think the test will be, once we see towards the end of next year how far inflation has come down, central banks may need to do quite a lot more in order to ensure that inflation comes down from what looks like being double-digit level. It will come down, but will it come all the way down to 2%? And simply asserting that because the inflation target is 2%, then it will come down to 2% is not really enough. And most central banks have fallen into that trap, I think, of just believing that because they say it'll come down to 2%, we'll all believe it. And we'll set prices, and wage bargainers will all believe that inflation will be 2%. But why will they believe that when inflation is now close to double-digit level? That's the challenge, I think, and that's a risk.
Do you include the Bank of England in that?
I think all major central banks have fallen prey to the same misconception, that just by stating an inflation target, you build into your models and your forecasts the assumption that inflation in the long run will always come down to 2%. I think that's a real stretch.
But the Bank of England was one of the central banks which did do more quantitative easing, more kind of creation of money in the wake of COVID. So presumably this criticism goes to them as well as the Fed.
It applies to the Bank of England, it applies to the Federal Reserve particularly, and it applies.
They just shouldn't have been printing that extra money.
They shouldn't have been printing the extra money. What governments were doing was enough to deal with the consequences of COVID.
And that, your point is, that has contributed to what we're now seeing in terms of the cost of living.
Yes, and it's true. You can see it with all central banks, that they're now worried about inflation when they weren't before. And it's not all the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And this was foreseeable, you think?
Yes, it was foreseeable, because it was a mistaken diagnosis of what needed to be done with the pandemic. In March 2020, people argued, well, there's some disruption in financial markets. We better intervene and print money to prevent a collapse of certain financial markets. But that went away within a matter of weeks. And at that point, you would have expected central banks to withdraw the support that they were giving. Rather than withdrawing it, they doubled down and did a lot more. And I think if you just print a great deal of money, it was most extreme in the United States, where the Federal Reserve printed money at a rate that was faster than at any point since the Second World War.
After COVID?
After COVID started, 2020, 2021. Their money supply, held by businesses and households, was growing at 25% a year. Now, you don't have to believe in a mechanical link between that and inflation, but you should be asking yourself the question, what do we think is going on here? If we keep printing money at this rate, what will happen? And the answer is obvious, you'll get inflation. But people have stopped thinking about it in those simple terms. And they've become obsessed, I think, with complex models, which can be helpful in some circumstances, but it's not a description of how the world works. And I think just asking the simple question, what is going on here, is a very important one to ask, because the pandemic was not like the sort of business cycles we'd seen in the past, where people lose confidence, stop investing and spending. You then cut interest rates to stimulate demand to get back to where the economy can produce. That wasn't the position at all in the pandemic. The governments and households basically decided, well, we're going to stop functioning for a while. And once supply goes down, the worst thing you can do at that point is to increase demand, because there's a real imbalance between the two. And if you stimulate money demand at the same time as output is contracting, the result is going to be inflation. Now, the good news here is that they're not printing money at that rate anymore. That stopped. So we can expect inflation to come back down. The real question, I think, is how deep will the recession have to be?
And there will have to be a recession.
I think well, who knows? We may get lucky. We may get lucky. Maybe there's a solution to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The future's unpredictable. But if inflation doesn't come back down as quickly as central banks hope, and in particular doesn't come back all the way to 2%, but only to say 4%, then they'll have to tighten policy further. And the particular worry at present, of course, is that the labour market in Britain is very, very tight. Unemployment, lowest level for 50 years, more vacancies than there are unemployed people for the first time ever.
Which is all good news.
Which it's good news, but what it means is you can't expect the supply side of the economy is being really constrained. And this is, with that tighter labour market, with wages rising anywhere between 5 and 7% a year, with inflation 9% a year and predicted to go higher, interest rates of just 1% don't look as if it's going to be the vehicle for bringing inflation right back down from double-digit levels to 2%.
But at the moment, markets are kind of, expecting, what is it, maybe 2.5% in the UK. Is your point that to you doesn't look like enough?
Well, we just don't know, and I think it's a mistake to predict where interest rates will go. That's one of the mistakes central banks have made in the last 10 years, which is to try and tell us where interest rates will go. They don't know, and nor do we. So we have to be prepared for higher interest rates. It's just that if you want to give a very strong and clear statement that we are determined to bring inflation back to the 2% target, you need to do a bit more interest rates now to give a very clear signal that that's what you're prepared to do. I don't think you need to say where rates will go, because I don't think you can know. But you've got to signal that you're prepared to take whatever action is necessary.
So what would you be doing if you were in the room?
Well, I don't give advice to my successors, and I'm not going to do that.
But nonetheless, I mean, for a very respected former central banker to be making these points, it's quite a serious point you're making about policy, here in the UK and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and there's a similar debate in the United States, where the Federal Reserve has come under a great deal of criticism for saying, well, we'll raise rates. Now they've changed their tune. They were going to raise rates by 25 basis points, each meeting. That could have left them still behind the curve a year from now. Now they may well make 50 basis points increases in successive meetings. My guess is that that's the minimum that's going to be needed to demonstrate strongly that you are really determined to bring inflation down, irrespective of what happens. Because the big lesson from the 1970s was that the two central banks that were the most determined to bring inflation back down in the 70s and took strong action to do so, the Bundesbank in Germany and the Swiss National Bank, not only were they more successful in bringing inflation down, they actually had the lowest recessions. By tackling inflation early, they prevented the need to keep raising rates in order to create a deeper recession, to stop an ingrained wage price spiral pushing inflation up. And that's what's most important. We've been through 30 years where people have got used to low inflation. They've accepted it. They've stopped talking about inflation. Unless we get back to that as quickly as possible, the risk is that people do start to worry about inflation all the time, and then wages are being pushed up, you get more industrial unrest, and you really need a deep recession in order to bring inflation back down. Let's hope we don't need to do that.
That really is the 1970s.
But that would be the 1970s. Now, we're not there yet, but it will need a very clear statement and signal by central banks to make sure that we don't end up there.
One of the things that you're kind of pointing towards is that a lot of this stuff was there in the can before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And actually, it's true. I mean, energy prices, these price cap increases happened before that, even though a lot of people are attributing it to that. So is your point that part of the rise in energy costs, which is kind of the big force of momentum here, that this was partly caused by too much QE, too much momentum in the system?
So I think it's very hard to work out how much was due to that mistake in monetary policy and how much was the result of specific factors. But what we're seeing now is inflation is spreading across the economy. It isn't just in one sector. And that's got to be the issue that the bank worries about, stopping it spreading to wage increases and to the service industries and so on. We can see in the United States, which is probably a bit ahead of us in this respect, that their problem now is that inflation has spread well into the service sector, which is the biggest part of the economy. You know, at the beginning, people were talking about, you know, second-hand car prices, etc. It's all one-off effects. Whenever inflation rises, you can always say, oh, it's this price increase or that price increase. No one sits around and all prices go up at the same time. You can always point to particular price increases. The issue really is what's the fundamental force driving higher inflation. And I think we've been through a period in which interest rates have been unnaturally low. The idea that 1% interest rates, even 2% interest rates, should be the norm, I think, is a very odd idea to hold.
Do you have a kind of vague idea of what the norm is in, you know, I'm not asking for a prediction, but I'm asking for your sense as to whether that has shifted from, you know, 5% or so when, you know, back when you were governor to something else now?
I think it's very hard to judge, and I think we'd like to get back to
but
a
not
position.
2%. 2% is too
No,
low.
I actually think it's too low, and I think it's weak economic growth that has led people to believe that the normal level of interest rates would be a lot lower. And I think that once we can get to a point where we restructure a lot of the debts of businesses that have been able to keep going because they could service their debts at almost negligible interest rates, then we can shift resources from those companies to more productive companies, more productive sectors in the economy. Productivity growth will pick up, and the natural consequence of that is that interest rates, the normal level of interest rates, will itself go back to the sort of level we saw before.
Okay, so yeah, it's not kind of, you know, 2% is the norm forever. I mean, that no. Okay.
I mean, one of the interesting things is that whether it's interest rates or whether it's the level of unemployment, people have an idea of what the normal level is because that's what we've experienced, and then it turns out actually we go through a period when it looks very different, and everyone says, oh, now it's got a new normal level. But it's always changing. It's always changing. It's very hard to see how a market economy can function with close to zero interest rates, where you're supposed to use the interest rate to decide which investment project to invest in, where the interest rate needs to be positive to give an incentive to save, to finance that investment, to generate economic growth. Interest rates need to be positive, and positive having adjusted for inflation. Well, at present, they're obviously pretty much negative adjusted for inflation.
When you've talked about a kind of error of policy, but has there also been an error, I mean, I assume the answer is yes, but has there also been an error of forecasting? Because, you know, the bank was forecasting basically flat inflation about a year and a bit ago. And so what's gone wrong there?
Well, a mistake is to believe that you can make accurate forecasts. I mean, economists on the 1st of January each year tend to make forecasts. They're always wrong. But there are good reasons why. Stuff happens. 1st of January 2020, all the economic forecasts published then, you could have torn up a few weeks later with the pandemic. 2021, at the beginning of the year, people were trying to forecast how quickly the economy would come back. We had a second wave. Forecasts again didn't make much sense. 1st of January 2022, no one forecast the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They didn't build it into their economic forecasts. So these forecasts are always going to be wrong. The more important thing to do is not to pretend that we know that inflation is going to be 3.2% in a particular year, but we try to identify the risks. What are the risks on the upside and the downside? What actions can we take to mitigate those risks? That's what policy is really all about. And if you think about the risks today, the risks are firmly, I think, on the side of inflation becoming more ingrained into the system because we keep talking about it, we expect it to happen, and we adjust our wage demands and our price setting decisions accordingly. And it's very important to try and get back to a world in which we thankfully stop talking about inflation once more.
Is it significant or relevant that this has begun with energy? I mean, does energy play a particular role? A lot of economists kind of almost try not to think about it, just treat it as an input. But is there a significance to the fact that there's, you know, we've got very high energy costs, and does that make it kind of somewhat different, somewhat faster to previous recessions?
Well, I think there are two ways in which it is different. The first one is that it clearly impacts different people in different ways. and it hurts particularly people on low incomes because you cannot change your heating system. You can't just say, oh, gas has gone up in price, maybe I'll switch to it, heat pump or something. You can't do that at all quickly. So you're stuck with it. There's no real action. And these terrible stories of people just switching off the heating illustrate the only course of action they can take. So it affects the welfare of people on low incomes significantly. I think the second is a wider reflection of the same problem. But the real issue here is that we don't produce all the energy ourselves. So we have to import quite a lot. And that means that when energy prices go up, it's a bit like the rest of the world imposing a tax on us as a country. So as a country, we're worse off, and there's nothing we can do about that. That makes it much, much harder to provide help and support for those who are hardest hit, because it's going to double down on the hit on people on average incomes or on better off incomes. And there just aren't enough very rich people to tap, to make the transfer to keep the rest of us from suffering too much. Everyone basically takes a hit when energy prices go up, and we can talk about how to make it, to help people on low incomes. But the idea that there is any way which as a country we can avoid this problem isn't true when it comes to energy.
It sounds like a particularly toxic cocktail, really.
Well, which is why I said before that when you get an intellectual mistake in policy and you allow inflation to start to rise, if you're then hit by bad luck, which is what happened in the 1970s and has happened now, it becomes something of a very unpleasant outcome. And it takes tough action, and it's not a pleasant period through which we're going to have to go.
It's a failure of economics, is it? Or a failure of conventional...
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I would not blame individuals in central banks. I think it's a failure of the economics profession to believe that...
Well, not the first one, it must be said, in recent decades.
Well, certainly in the 70s we had a similar problem. Now we've got the issue in which people believe that they can produce fancy computer models, and you ask them, what determines inflation in your model? And they say the inflation target. And then you say, but surely you can't just announce what inflation will be. It reflects what's going on in the economy. And the models don't take that into account, amazingly. So I do think that this was a mistake of the economics profession, which has spread, understandably, into central banks, which employ the graduates produced by universities, and that they adopt the conventional wisdom of the time. And I think it's misled us on this occasion, followed, as I said, by some bad luck.
Is it, do you think this is a greater challenge than any that you faced when you were governor?
Well, in some ways, I think it probably is, though I think the similarity...
But you went through, you had the financial crisis.
We had the financial crisis, but I think, in a way, that the worse the situation became, the easier it was to know what the answer was. I mean, I think in the financial crisis, it didn't take very long to work out that the banks were undercapitalized, that the banks themselves had borrowed too much, and they were very fragile. And the only way to restore confidence in the banking system was to recapitalize the banks. It took time to persuade everyone to do it, but eventually we got there. Now I think, again, we know what the problem is. Monetary policy has been too loose. It needs to be tightened. And the problem for central banks is that, for very understandable reasons, they don't want to say, maybe we got it wrong in the last year or so. The obvious piece of advice you give to a central bank today is, I wouldn't start from here. But they are, and that's the problem.
And I mean, there's been lots of scrutiny, shall we say, of the Bank of England in the last few weeks. I mean, there's going to be more, isn't there?
Well, there's bound to be more when inflation rises so far above target. But I think the important thing for them is to give very strong, clear signals that they will take action to bring inflation down, and they're going to have to be patient. Just as we were in the financial crisis, the first 6 to 12 months of that were very difficult for the bank. We felt we were doing the right thing, and I think in time we will prove right. I think provided central banks take appropriate action now, they will see a fall in inflation next year. And no predictions, but I think this will, it's very likely.
Appropriate action meaning raising interest rates quite considerably.
Well, I don't want to speculate on, how far they should do it, but I think doing something which illustrates that it's not just talking about it, it's actions as well.
But they are raising rates.
They're raising rates. The trouble is at present rates are so low relative to where they ought to be in order to have a chance of bringing inflation back down. And what I hope is that they just don't leave it too long, because then they may end up raising rates but at the wrong time. This is the time to do it, not in 6 months, 12 months' time when we may be facing a much more difficult economic situation.
Put all of this together, and I mean, how concerned are you about Bank of England independence? This is a story that you are, you're a big part of it. You're one of the part of the origin story of it in a way.
Well, I don't think there is a threat to legal independence of the Bank of England. I think any government that tried to undo independence would immediately see a very adverse reaction in markets. The rate at which governments could borrow would go up. So I don't think that's a threat. I think what is most important now is that the bank has a very clear and simple narrative. I think don't keep it too complicated, keep it simple, which makes it easier then for governments to support and back the central bank.
Do you worry though that by intervening like this or making these points as you are with your reputation, that might then give those who want to knock the bank more ammunition to take them down?
Well, let me be very clear. I'm criticising the ideas of the economics profession which have come to influence central banks. It's the ideas that are wrong. And I don't criticise individuals in it, because I think you can't blame them for going along with what is a conventional wisdom. What we need is a debate about the ideas behind all this. And I think that's what's important. And if we can change that narrative somewhat, I think it will be easier for the bank. Because as I said, if you look ahead, they're not printing money at a rapid rate now. So they have a good story to tell about where inflation is going and why it will come back to the target in due course. But they've got to have that simple narrative, I think, in order to retain the credibility which was built up over a long period since really 1992 and a lot further since independence in 1997. 25 years ago.
Yeah, 25. This is the anniversary. So it's funny how I think at various anniversaries there's been a crisis that we've ended up talking about more than the successes of the past few decades. But
if I look back at my time in the Bank of England, which I joined in 1991, I think there was a crisis every single year in some part of the world, which affected what we were trying to achieve.
But by the way, are you passing this advice on? To colleagues at the bank?
Well, I don't give advice in public, and whether or not I do it in private, I will reflect on it. I'm always there. They know how to get hold of me.
Please join me in a massive round of applause to welcoming Lord Mervyn King.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I should apologise right at the outset for wearing a tie. Google is actually a lot more tolerant in this respect than some other places, because I remember going when I was at the bank with some colleagues to the Palo Alto area, and Hal Varian, your chief economist, who's an old friend, showed us around Mountain View, and it was a very civilised visit. We enjoyed it enormously. And then we went off to Facebook. And as we got to Facebook, we were greeted by a young woman straight out of college who had this missionary zeal on her face. And we're about 4 of us, and we're all wearing suits and ties from the Bank of England, of course. And as we walked in to go up a staircase, she pointed to a picture, because they spent vast amounts of money in Facebook doing up an old warehouse to make it look like an old warehouse. And there was a poster on the wall with a man in grey hair in a suit and tie. And she pointed at this man and said, "That's the enemy." So I'm forever grateful to Google for being more
receptive to people who wear ties.
Welcome, we love ties. I'm wearing a TM Lewin shirt, which also puts me slightly out of there. What do you see as the difference between engineering and economics? We're in an engineering building. There's many engineers in the room here. And you were saying earlier, economics perhaps started as a scientific engineering subject.
Well, after the Second World War it did. I think what was very striking in the early 1960s was that there was an influx of mathematicians and natural scientists into economics. And people wrote highly mathematical treatises. And the old idea of the invisible hand, Adam Smith, Paul Samuelson wrote his textbook, highly mathematical. And economists got more and more excited about the fact that they could be like scientists and we could make accurate predictions. And I remember in the 60s as a student that people were constructing computer models of the economy and applying control engineering techniques to it to optimize the path of the economy. So you choose interest rates and fiscal policy to optimize the path of the economy. And this was a tremendous, exciting development. And it all failed, completely failed. And the reason is that, and it's of fundamental importance, and I don't think it's fully been grasped since, that there are no natural constants in economics. There are no laws that you can believe hold exactly. And one of the things that's crucially important in understanding the behavior of the economy are people's beliefs about what will happen in the future, expectations. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these can be pinned down by what look like sensible or plausible views of the world. But other times the future is so inherently unknowable that there's no rational basis on which to form expectations about the future. And so in the book, what I talk about is that people don't optimize, they cope. Mm-hmm. And that is the big difference, I think, between engineering and physics, where you can genuinely believe that there are laws of nature determining paths. You may not know what they all are, and you try and discover more about it. But once you've discovered them, they're paths. And economics, where there are no fixed scientific immutable laws like that. And I think economists are deeply reluctant to admit this because it will pull them back into the pack of all the other social sciences. Sure. And it was always very thrilling to be thought of on the same level as engineers and scientists. When you realize actually you're not, it becomes a bit of a shock.
Okay. So the book is called The End of Alchemy, Money, Banking, and the Future of Global Economy. What do you mean when you say alchemy?
Well, the traditional meaning of the word alchemy is to turn base metal into gold, change something that in reality isn't very valuable into something that is. That's clearly been true of money down the generations, paper money, electronic money. There's no inherent value to it. It depends on trust, people's willingness to accept it, and the trust of the people issuing it. But it's even more true of banks because you put your money in a bank, it has a deposit. The bank tells you can take it out whenever you want to make a payment or to have cash. Actually, if we all did that, they wouldn't be able to meet the demand because they've used the deposits to finance highly illiquid loans. So there is something, it's a sort of alchemy to believe that all of us have deposits in banks which are highly liquid and we can use them whenever we want. And yet at the same time, they're backed by something that cannot possibly meet that demand. That's what I mean by alchemy.
Okay. And by when illiquid, just in case anyone isn't clear, illiquid means?
So the bank would make a loan to a household or a company where they would say, well, I will lend to you for 10 years for a mortgage or for an investment. And there's no way the bank can get the money back until that period.
Yep.
So if someone walked into the bank and says, terribly sorry, I'd like all my money out, the bank can't then turn round to the people it's lent to and say, well, I know I said I'd lend to you for